All right, we're here this morning, back at 11 a.m.-ish on Thursday. I'm Zach Teasdale. I'm sitting around here with Pastor Brian King and Holly. We are, who I always want to pronounce your name wrong, but it's Peacher, right?
It is.
So if you guys ever see Holly, it's Peacher.
How do people mispronounce it?
Petcher.
Petcher.
Okay. All right.
That's how I pronounce it too. And so we're looking at 1 Corinthians 13 today, which is going to be just the message on Sunday. Pastor C, I think, is doing the chat this Sunday on that. I'm talking about the church. And Holly was just bringing up, we were talking a little bit before we started, we prayed and read it a little bit, and Holly was sharing a few thoughts on this kind of being used at weddings a lot. And Holly, can you share a little bit of what you were just kind of sharing with your reflection on that?
So we're also studying a book. I am a church member in my small group, and we're just talking about 1 Corinthians 13 just this past week, and how we always refer to 1 Corinthians as the love chapter. You hear it in weddings, referred to in marriage encounters, and however, 1 Corinthians 12, Paul is writing to the church of Corinth and trying to encourage them and give them direction and discipline. And the very last part of chapter 12, he says, and yet I will show you the most excellent way, how you can live and love. And then chapter 13 starts. So really chapter 13, he's telling the church of Corinth how to love each other and to be a stronger church and to lift each other up. And so I think that's really interesting if we could just apply that more to our fellow church members.
Yeah. It gets very heavily used in weddings, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing to use in weddings, but often then the tone is just things are so. When you get married, it's very lovey-dovey and emotional. It's easy to say, yes, I'm feeling all of these things, kindness and looking out for the other person, and so it really has that sense of just affirming what you already do. But 1 Corinthians is written to a church that has lots of problems. It's people who are not loving each other, and they're excluding each other. And earlier in the book, it's that there is. Talk about the Lord's Supper and how the rich people are excluding the poor people, and they're totally dysfunctional. So this is really like a correction of look, this is what it looks like to live this life of love, and that's a lot different tone than we often assign to it, because we assign that nice cursive, frame it and hang it on the wall wedding tone, and it's really sort of it's kind of a call to action.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like. Holly, you also mentioned just kind of doing this towards church people, and I love that this is an action that is just as you love people, which is your neighbor and everybody. These are just things that you do, right? These are just kind of the outflowings of the characteristic of loving people, right? But I also love that you mentioned it towards church people, because I often think about that verse, and they'll know we're Christians by our love, right? And I often feel like we take that as a love towards the outsiders, right? Love towards people outside the church. But he's really talking about they'll know that we're Christians because of how intense our love is towards other Christians. That's going to be the thing that they're like, wow, they treat each other so well, they support each other so well, they care about each other in such an intense way that those people must be Christians, and that they'll notice that there's something special and unique about that, because most people don't love each other in this way. And I love too what you're talking about, because I would understand if somebody here loved their spouse like this, right? If you were this intentional about loving a spouse, with love that with love that is patient and kind and doesn't envy and isn't proud. It's like you work really hard to love one person like that. But when this is just generally how you treat people,
right?
People at your church, people, that's a little bit more impressive. It's a little bit more difficult, I think.
Yeah, because like Jesus says, "Oh, you love the people who love you." That's great. Even the pagans do that. Even the tax collectors do that.
Right.
Yay! Pat yourself on the back. You love someone who loves you back.
It's easy.
Not someone that you're having a conflict with.
Yep.
Right.
And Jesus says, "No, you love your enemies. You pray for those who curse you."
Right.
And then you can dump that context right into this chapter.
Right.
Yeah. So we've got some of these questions written up here. We always give you guys these questions as guidelines so you can look through them and read through them and kind of have something to talk about. If you ever need to go off or you talk about one or anything like that, perfectly fine, as you will notice that we often do. But I was looking at, I get excited about some questions, even though I wrote them, some questions more than others. But the second question I thought was I don't want to say insightful because I wrote it.
It hit you, though.
It hit me, though.
Right.
But why, God uses a few different examples in verses 1 through 3, and he kind of says that we are nothing even if we do those things without love. And I'm curious for you guys why you think he uses those examples that he does.
And just to reiterate, that is speaking in the tongues of men and angels, having a gift of prophecy and knowing mysteries, having knowledge, and then also giving possessions to the poor.
Mm-hmm. And he kind of says, but if you do that without love, I gain nothing, or I am nothing.
Right. Holly, you're wiser than us. Why don't you have any idea?
Did you just say I'm older than you?
I said wiser.
We learn. That was good.
Well, I think especially, sometimes as church members, when we come to church, we think that we need to perform these acts because we're church members, or we need to do these things just because we call ourselves Christians. When actually God says if you do these things without really loving others, there's nothing to it. And that can be hard sometimes. Sometimes I think we should check ourselves before we do something. Are we helping the person on the street who needs $20 just so that we can say, well, I helped somebody this week who needed $20? Right. Or are we doing it because God really told us to go out and reach others and to truly love them?
Act out of that spirit of love.
Yeah.
Right.
I think he's kind of taking down a peg in the previous chapter. He talks about spiritual gifts. He talks about this miraculous speaking in tongues. He talks about prophesying, and those were looked at as the, hey, you're more spiritual if you have those gifts. I mean, those are flashy. Those are groovy. Those are the ones that you want.
Right.
But then he kind of knocks them down a peg and say, hey, you prophesy. You think that and so you do that to be proud of yourself,
right?
Or to say, hey, I'm in this spiritual level. No, if you do that not out of a spirit of love, of bringing God's word, bringing God's truth to someone else, you're just making noise.
Yeah. I like that one in verse 3 too. If I give all that I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship, right? I think you hear that first part. I give over my body to hardship, like I'm willing to go through suffering and be persecuted, that I may boast.
There you go.
I think I think we all struggle with this quite a bit. But that we do these things for the look at me, look at how great I am, and we know that he calls that out with speaking in tongues. Like that's an easy one. Everybody liked the people who could speak in tongues. It was so cool, you know what I mean? And it was like, wow, that's so unique. That person must be. But he's like, if you're doing that for kind of this boast thing, or if you're doing it, for yourself, and rather than loving people and trying to help people, what's the point of it? So I'm curious for you guys. Now I'm going off questions and off. What are those things for you guys? Just in order to personalize it, what are those things for you guys that you tend to do or you're tempted to do for the boasting aspect rather than for the love aspect?
For me, it can be anything big or small, but I'll use like a small example, just around the house as a husband or as a dad. If I'm gonna serve and do something, whether it's I emptied the dishwasher, I did Simon's chore when he didn't, or that kind of a thing, and do it in terms of, hey, I'm pulling my weight around here, rather than God's placed me in this building with these people, for our lives here to serve each other. And in truth, my wife serves more than I do. I don't know, maybe she has these thoughts and whatnot too. But when I get them, I recognize when God's working on me that those things are put in my life to serve my neighbor. In this case, my neighbor being my family. Right. But using the term neighbor as Jesus uses it.
Right.
and to have it be out of the extension of that relationship to them and that love for them, not so I can say, hey, I've checked the boxes, or maybe even checked more boxes than I did before, checked more boxes than someone else in the family did. A, I'm usually wrong about that I'm checking more boxes than the other person,
there with you,
and B, that I'm doing it in a clanging cymbal kind of a way, as Paul puts it, and not in a way that is patient, kind, not envying, not keeping a record of wrongs, or in this case, trying to keep a record of rights.
Keeping a record of rights. Yep, look how better I am.
Well, I think that we tend to want to boast if it's anything nice that we do, or if you... it's like you want people to know what you did. You know, why do we do that? Well, because that's just how we're made to, want some kind of recognition. So I think it's challenging, but I think what would be cool is to try to do those things, something nice, and not tell anybody. So you picked up somebody's chore at home, and you don't go say, hey, I did your chore for you, but just do it and go on, you know. Now, I know nobody wants to clean the litter box if it's not their day to clean the litter box, but it's just an example, I mean, I've had times in my life where someone has anonymously given me cash because they knew I was going through a hard time and they wanted it to be anonymous. And that was their way of blessing me, and they didn't want any kind of credit for it. And so I think those are the things that God wants to see us do, not boast, and it to be a true love, doing things out of true love for someone.
Yeah, I had a few of those situations, and I forget how I discovered some of these things, but I had a few friends who did things like that, where they paid for somebody else's bill, or they whatever, and they really clearly didn't tell anyone about it. So I don't remember how I found out that it happened or that they did it. But I was just so impressed by that. It was like I'm gonna go. I did this thing that I could pretty easily brag about, and I think, I forget how exactly that ended up, or how exactly I came to find the information. But they didn't want the temptation of boasting about it, I think about this, like, for me, for a few things. I'm pretty proud of the fact that, like, I wanted to be more involved in my neighborhood, and so I switched gyms to go to a different neighborhood. And at the start, it kind of started, and it's still there, but at the start, it was especially more like, you know what, I want to be invested in my neighborhood, I want to be invested in the people there. And now it kind of sometimes tempts me to be like, yeah, look at me. I left my community in order to love my neighbors better. Look at how good I am.
Right, and, well done. God, thank you that I'm not like other men who just stay at their own gym.
And they're slackers, and they go with the comfortable thing. And then it turns into that, love is not self-seeking. That's pretty self-seeking right there. Right. You know what I mean? And so I think you're right, though, Holly. I think it can happen in tons of different areas where it just kind of becomes self-seeking, and how to have that motivation. Recognizing that we won't be perfect at it, but how to have that motivation where I'm really just doing it for the other person, and I don't need the glory or the praise for it. But man, that's not easy. Yeah. Interesting.
And this might be, I don't know if this is flipping to another question too quick, but Zach, you have some other questions that you were listing. One is about we love because God first loved us, and something that stands out to me is. He doesn't say, starting in verse 4, where he starts listing out the checklist of the things that love is, like verses 4 through verse 8. He doesn't say, this is what you're supposed to do. He says, this is what love is. Right. And so this is a picture, really, of God's love. Yeah. And I recognize that we can, like, start beating ourselves up in a lot of ways about, and wigging ourselves out. Was I loving enough? Was I doing this out of a good motive enough that it was loving? And if not, I'm reminded of Martin Luther, who'd turn around after he did his confession, when he was a monk, and then he'd realize that he was confessing out of not because of repentance, but because of checking the list, or because of responsibility, or because he wanted it to seem like he had confessed a lot of sins, and he'd go back and confess that, and he'd go back and confess that, and he was driving his priest, his instructor, crazy that he was doing that. And we can fall into that trap too. But Paul recognizes in verse 12, he says, now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Right. And I know that in this world where my sinful self is dead and drowned, but still in some ways
Right.
hanging around my neck or running around like a dead chicken with its head
Right.
cut off,
Right.
and still tripping me up.
Yeah.
That I can't say anything that I do is ever going to be with a pure
Right.
motive,
Exactly.
and I can go with that confidence of God's love toward me.
Right.
That the more I recognize His love,
Right.
that my motives are going to be better, but that it can be counterproductive to do a good deed and then give myself this total evaluation for 20 minutes of like, did you have a little bit of a
Right.
selfish motive in
Right.
that was
Right.
for you and not for someone
Right.
else? Because that is going to be there, and
Yeah.
I
Sure.
can't completely erase that. And I think there are some believers, sincere believers, whose spiritual life is based around, did I do it well enough this time? Even though we know that we're saved completely through God's grace,
Right.
through faith in Him, through the work of Jesus,
Right.
that when it comes down to the things that I do, I still live like, oh, did I do that thing well
Right.
enough? And it's not to say that these things aren't worth working on, but that
Right.
I look to God's love for me first.
Right.
And then, wow, and just thank Him and amazed that He takes my lurching, stumbling spiritual life that's gonna dog me until I see Him face to face,
Yeah.
and still chooses to work through me. It's really amazing.
Yeah, I feel like maybe I've said it the last couple of weeks too, but that's just because it's been on my mind. It's just a little bit more the idea of, we try to glorify God, but we do it in the sense of in the reality of the freedom that we have now. Right? I mean, we've already been made alive, right? We don't have to worry about all those little things, earning our salvation and that kind of stuff. We are this new creation. We have been forgiven, and so now we go and we try.
Not to prove ourselves to God, but
exactly.
try because my neighbor needs it.
Because my neighbor needs it.
We were just doing. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but last night we were working Faith 101 with middle school students, and we were talking about the fourth petition of the Lord's Prayer: "Give us this day our daily bread." And one of the things that we focused on was that God uses you to bring other people their daily bread.
Right.
And maybe that's a friendship, maybe that's literal bread or food or coat or warm clothing and that kind of a thing, but that God puts me here to work to serve my neighbor, to show His love to my neighbor.
Yeah.
The things that I do is not for righteousness from me to
Right,
God that
exactly.
I'm proving, but it's
Exactly.
that there's people in this world that He wants to serve through me, and that's kind of a
Right.
humbling and empowering thought too. Kind of excites you for it.
Right. I think the other thing that we do, when we do have the impure motives or when we are wrong in kind of how we're doing things, I think a lot of times we try to react to the symptom rather than like the actual cause. Where if we're sick and we're sneezing a bunch, or we're trying to stop the sneezing instead of stopping the cold.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And I don't want to jump back and spend too much time thinking like, oh, let's make ourselves perfect. But if I'm having a tough time loving Holly because she's frustrated at me for not being as organized as I need to be.
That never happens.
Exactly. No, never. If that is, instead of trying to focus on the actual, me being frustrated, I'm going to sit there and think a little bit more about, am I enjoying God's love towards me, right? Because like you said, we look at 1 John 4:19 and we see that God loves us first, and we love because He loved us first. And just kind of thinking about, is everything, how am I enjoying God, and how am I reflecting on His love? And am I aware that I'm free right now? Am I aware that I'm okay? Am I aware that Holly's free right now? Am I aware that Holly's loved by God? Mm-hmm. So instead of just trying to change the way I think, trying to remind myself of the reality that the people, my neighbors, God loves my neighbors a lot. They're worth a lot. They're, we see in Romans chapter 2, they're no more or less worthy of salvation than I am, mm-hmm. right? And so if that's true, they're no worse than me. They're no better than me in terms of deserving salvation.
Well, I like how in question 4 you go to the 1 John 4:19, and just to remind us, we love because He first loved us. He died for us. We love Him. Verse 20 says, "So whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar." And then so I feel like it just kind of points us right back to 1 Corinthians. So okay, so how do I need to love? And like you were just saying, Zach, I think what I have done in the past, years, is there are people who are going to irritate you.
Right.
And you're going to be like, but God, it is so hard for me to love that person. How?
Right.
And somehow I got to the realization that, you know what? I bet some people feel that way about me.
Mm-hmm.
That it's hard for them to love me.
Feel that way about me, I'm sure.
And I don't want people, hating me or dissing me because I'm irritable to them.
Right.
And so it kind of helped me to bring it all down to base level. God died for all of us.
Right.
We're all his children.
Right.
Sometimes the people that are really hard to love, I will say, but they're one of God's children.
Right.
And he loves them as much as he loves me.
Right.
And that's how I need to love them.
And so then the love comes not from you're trying to conjure it up yourself,
Exactly.
but by you're asking God to readjust how you look at someone,
Exactly.
look at them the way that he looks at them, and then it's going to be possible then to be patient and kind and not keep a record of wrongs with them.
I remember at some point reading Romans 5 and just being like a little struck by the reality of my sinfulness. And there's like four words that God kind of describes us in Romans 5, just kind of the first half, but that we were sinners, we were ungodly, we were powerless to remove ourselves from that situation. And then the fourth one is the one that hit me, that we were enemies of God. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what? Mm-hmm. I thought I was like neutral, right? I thought maybe I was like in the middle ground, like God was annoyed, but I was, but like to think that in the fight of good versus evil,
you were like the orc.
Exactly. I was on the side of
That's
evil.
from Lord of the Rings, just so you know. Holly claims to not know a lot of pop culture. Yet she just used the word dissin, which is like an 80s hip-hop reference.
I liked that. That was good. I still use that word, 2 cards on the table. But yeah, like, and so, as you're thinking about like the reality, and being pointed back to God's love for us and understanding the reality of our identity, other people's identity, God's love for all of us and the intenseness of it. Like I had to, as I started to realize, like I was God's enemy. I was a big pain. That there's no way that I'm better than
working against his purposes.
Yeah. That when somebody is negative towards me, I wasn't neutral towards God. I was negative towards God. Mm-hmm. And he loved and forgave me when I was there, and he continues to love and forgive me no matter what. So why would I judge somebody else? Right. Why would I think somebody else deserves to not be loved or forgiven? And I think that I still don't love people perfectly, but when I'm closer to it, I think it's because I realize because that's just the reality of around us, is that they deserve the love because God says they deserve it. Mm-hmm. Man, interesting.
So what do you think leads to our being able to love people more? I'll throw that out to each of you. You asked the question, is there anything you need to help you enjoy your time with God more? I might frame the question as what do I need? What reality do I need to know? How could my time be well spent so that God does have the room to conjure up that love within me, to instill that love in me that then goes out to other people, that looks like these characteristics in 1 Corinthians 13.
So the biggest thing for me, this is I guess a little story, like going back to high school and stuff like that. I would see my friends who were getting drunk, or see my friends who were doing things that they were clearly wrong, and it seemed to me like they didn't feel guilty about it, and I didn't understand why this was the case. Like, why do I have such a tough time doing things that are wrong and other people seem fine with it? And so it annoyed me a little bit. I had some prayers with God about that, because I wanted to just kind of be able to be happy like the people around me. And then as I talked to people, especially, I don't know, in the future years, who were either doing similar things or it was just the same people, I found out they were feeling pretty guilty and bad about themselves at the time too. Mm-hmm. And so the thing that helped me was kind of seeing past the mask that people put on and seeing what was underneath. And so if people were starting to discover that a lot of times when people were mean to me or violent, or that they were hurting underneath. And so as I discovered like that reality, it made it a lot easier to love people, because I didn't see people. I still see people like this, so I don't want to be. But I saw people less as mean people or violent people or uncaring people or ungodly people, and more as just
broken, hurting people like us.
Exactly, exactly, and that helped me a lot. And so it was some of that reflection of seeing what people were like.
Yeah, and I think that just circles back to the beginning of chapter 13, kind of what we started out talking about. All of these things about speaking in tongues, preaching, prophesying, giving. Those are external actions, right. And those are like those. I think that's on the opposite, or maybe the flip side of the coin of what you were talking about. You were looking at the external, the vices that people had, the obvious, what we call, bad habits or evil habits that people had, but didn't see inside them. Sometimes doing these external things are these things that are considered to be good things, godly things. Mm-hmm. You don't see inside someone's heart there either. Right. And so without that love in someone's heart, then that all becomes emptiness. And I think that's probably instructive what you said, and then circling to what this said and said, to say we don't know what's going on in people's hearts, and and I'd be ashamed for people to know what goes on in my heart sometimes, the motives that I have for things, but that when we see it through the lens that God sees it, he allows us to see beyond just judging for good or ill, whatever the action someone is taking is, and to say, hey, that person is just like me, naturally a foreigner, stranger, enemy of God, all those ways that Paul talks about it, but also someone who God loves very much and demonstrates these loving characteristics toward, and so I'm to do that as well because they're my neighbor and my neighbor needs that. Yeah,
I think coming to that conclusion that this is just the truth, rather than something that I should do or that I need. It's just the reality. It's the truth. This is who I am. This is who they are. This is who God is. And kind of being more aware of the truthful situation is what I think is really helpful and assists.
I think it's important to remember that we all come from different circumstances. There was a point in my life where I had gone through a divorce, and so I had problems with some bitterness and some anger, and so I wanted to say to people, well, I should feel this way. I've been betrayed, or I should feel this way, and I wanted to feel justified. But maybe the other people on the other end had no clue. They could not relate to my circumstances, and so I think that has helped me just to remember. Everyone comes from a different background. They've had different circumstances, and maybe I can't relate to their circumstances, but I can guarantee you their situation has been just as real and just as bad to them that my situation has been. Yeah. So that helps me sometimes to extend that love.
100% agree. We should wrap it up so that those of you guys who are still listening have a little bit of time left in your day to do other things. Thank you guys for listening. This will come out today around 4 p.m. so you'll be hearing it on Thursday. Cheers, guys.
All right.